Hello and welcome to Voice of Liberty. My name is Henry Conley, and tonight we're going to talk about Israel and we're going to talk about Iran. And the reason we're going to talk about Israel and Iran tonight is because outside of what you might see in the typical mainstream news, there has been increasing escalation of violence from Israel towards Iran. There has been an increased, what seems to be push from Israel to invoke war or provoke war against Iran. And we're going to talk about what implications that has on the elections or what it has to do with the upcoming presidential elections. So first, to cue everybody in that hasn't been really paying attention to what's been going on in Israel and Iran, the first thing that needs to be talked about is that Iran and Israel have literally been at each other's throats. They are constantly at each other's throats. There is no getting around this. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form defending Iran when I discuss this. Iran is a country which frequently just murders its citizens. It restricts the liberties and the freedoms of its citizens. And we could get into a discussion on how that occurred in Iran in another podcast. But what I want to talk about tonight is what's been happening. Over the last few weeks and even months, Iranian oil pipelines have been mysteriously blowing up. Different ships in Iranian harbors have recently been mysteriously catching fire. Production facilities have been bombed. A nuclear development facility in Iran that was theorized to be developing a nuclear bomb was mysteriously struck by a missile, then later claimed by Israel. And the question that we have to talk about here is, why is this occurring now? Why are these attacks from Israel on Iran, on Iranian bases, on Iranian infrastructure occurring more? And the answer is pretty simple, actually. When you look at it, the reason Iran is being attacked by Israel has to do directly with the November election. See, Israel wants war with Iran. Israel has wanted war with Iran. They've wanted it for years. This dates back to the Bush era with John Bolton in charge of things. Israel has wanted war with Iran. Israel has wanted to expand its territory to take over Iranian-backed territories. Israel and Iran are the most likely two nations to get into a full-scale war and most likely nations to spark World War III. Now, why does Israel want to start this war now? And why are they increasingly pushing for war with Iran? And the simple answer is this. They know that with Donald Trump at the helm, with Donald Trump as president of the United States, getting U.S. backing on a war that they provoke is more likely to occur. And that is simply because Republicans and Trump's base historically back Israel. They historically will defend Israel, and they think that Israel is a rightful existing nation. Now, I take no stance on this. I recognize that the Palestinians have been being put down by the Israelis for years. I recognize that aspect of things, but I do not take a stance on whether Israel is a properly existing nation. But the Republicans have. And having Donald Trump in the White House and having Donald Trump able to control the reaction to an ally of ours being attacked by Iran, that goes in Israel's favor. See, Israel cannot win a war against Iran. Israel, if they go to war against Iran, will lose. Israel will become Iranian territory. It's simple as that. The Israeli military is strong. The Israeli Air Force is very strong. They have retired U.S. weapons. The thing is, so does Iran. Iran, though, has one thing going for them that Israel doesn't have. They have a larger standing army. They have a larger Air Force, and their military hardware is more plentiful. So for Israel to get its desired war with Iran, they must have U.S. backing. They must have the backing of the United States. This isn't to say that Joe Biden would not back Iran or Israel during a war. It is entirely likely that he would, because they are an ally. And because that is how the system is traditionally set up. But the thing that must be noted here is that it is way more likely to receive support under a Trump presidency. So they are pushing hard right now. They're pushing hard to provoke Iran into war, goad them into war, and bring the U.S. into the war, recognizing that Donald Trump is more than likely going to lose the November 2020 election. So they spark their war now. They get their war now. They get U.S. backing. So that way when Joe Biden becomes the president of the United States, I nearly wanted to puke saying that, they still have U.S. backing due to the war having happened prior to the election. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu and Hassan Rouhani, they have had back and forth discussions. There are back channel discussions occurring there. It's occurred after the U.S. strike on General Soleimani. It occurred after the retaliatory strikes of Iran against the United States. There were back channel communications. Those back channel communications have not occurred since then, and I have a theory as to why. See, the U.S. killing of General Soleimani was not to take out a terrorist leader. The U.S. killing of General Soleimani was nothing more than a ploy to attempt to goad Iran into a war with the Israelis, being that Iran would be less likely to go directly up against the United States military, knowing that we could beat them, but going up against Israel would be an attack on our ally and cause us to potentially step down. Now, being that that tactic failed, we now look at this tactic. This tactic is the last line, the last-ditch effort to provoke war and get Trump's war and Benjamin's war, and, in theory, in Israeli and U.S. thinking, take out the Iranian state. Now, it must be mentioned before I sign off here and I say, be a voice of liberty, that the reason the Iranian state exists the way it is now is due to U.S. and British interference in their political structure and in their political system. It must be noted that I do not support foreign war and foreign intervention unless we are attacked on our own soil. I do not think that we should be involved in this conflict. But the point of this video is to point out the fact that there will more than likely will be some sort of conflict between Iran and Israel prior to November. We will more than likely be involved in said conflict, whether it's a short-term military exercise or military strike or whatever, or it's a long-term continuation of the wars in the Middle East. Anybody that researches this, watches this, can see what's going on. So the first thing we need to do as Voices of Liberty is to be actively speaking out against this, keeping what is occurring, what we see occurring, in the news, in the spotlight. Use the algorithms that Facebook and Twitter have to keep the topic live, because we need to be a voice of liberty and awaken the voice of liberty in others to speak out against these actions. Because this will be more than Iranian and Iraq or Israeli war. This will be more than the U.S. being on the Israeli side against Iran. The scary part about this is there will be innocent people on both sides who die. Not just soldiers, not just airmen, but literal civilians. It will be a repeat of what we saw in Iraq and what we saw in Afghanistan and what we're seeing in Syria, where innocent civilians get caught in the crossfire or their houses get bombed by a stray bomb. So let's do what we failed to do with Iraq and Afghanistan because there was blood in our eyes and fire in our eyes. Let's be a voice of liberty. Let's awaken the voice of liberty, and let's ensure that there is no war.